philosophy department. Father Tom has done what sometimes happens. I'm left holding a mop with very little to clean up because he covered a lot of the scope. I'll try and come at it from a slightly different approach. I'll begin by reviewing or presenting some of the highlights of homelessness and poverty in the history of philosophy. So great moments of homelessness and poverty among philosophers. Just a few of those, because they're interesting stories in their own right. Then I'll talk a little bit about the modern approach in philosophy to ethics and to social justice, and specifically the concept of moral luck. It's a term with which you're probably not familiar, but how it leads to a specific attitude, you might say, or a strategy on thinking philosophically and rationally about justice and poverty and so forth. So Socrates is usually identified as the first figure of Western philosophy, and he was a part-time homeless guy, part-time vagabond, mostly by choice. He wasn't compelled to live in poverty, but it was something like voluntary simplicity, and he spent a lot of his time in the streets. He was a public figure, and he suffered for this, and to some extent we benefit from it because he spoke enough so that people wrote down his ideas, mainly his star pupil, Plato, and the rest is history, as they say. But Socrates was comfortable and brought in public and in the streets, and represents, at least for my purposes now, a kind of interesting role, the role of the people who are alienated or disadvantaged and appear in public as symptoms, or they have something to tell us, you might say. They're signs of something. We could hurry up and say they're signs of a social dysfunction or a social failure, like why aren't these people at home? That might be a little too hasty, because there might be even a positive role for the outsiders. That brings me to the second highlight of homelessness in the history of philosophy. And that was a philosopher who was homeless and impoverished, not as an amateur, but as a full-on professional. And that was Diogenes the Cynic. And he flourished about 200 years after Socrates, and he chose to live outside of the city walls because he felt that the rules of the city were too confining and too hypocritical. So he famously lived in a barrel, Diogenes the Cynic did. And there are some interesting stories told about him. The one that's best known is that Alexander the Great, who was at that time the most powerful and affluent and important person in the world, had heard about Diogenes the Cynic because Diogenes, sort of like Socrates, was a bit of an irritant, and he publicly aired his own views about these things: the hypocrisy of society, the artificiality of its laws, the injustices that it often inflicted upon its people. He was a bit of a rabble-rouser, Diogenes was. His reputation spread enough so that Alexander the Great happened to be passing through the city of Syracuse, I think, at the time, and decided to look this guy up. He didn't have an address, so he had to find him. And Alexander had a short conversation with Diogenes. Diogenes expounded his fairly iconoclastic view on politics and philosophy and things. And as the story goes, Alexander was so impressed that he said, if I had a chance to be reborn again, I would either be Alexander the Great or I would be Diogenes the Cynic, but nothing in between. So he gave him a sense of the extreme the stakes, you might say, that are involved in committing to a life of one sort or another. Our word cynic, by the way, this is a bit of an aside, is related to the Greek word for, comes directly from the Greek word for dog, kunikos, so canine. We get canine and cynic, they're part of the same world, because Diogenes lived as dogs would live, and behaved as dogs would do. It was not exactly a complimentary term, because he was like a dog, like a dirty dog outside the city. Sense in which we are all the same is that we inhabit a world which is dicey. It's chancy. I could get up from this classroom and go down the stairs and that'd be the end of me. Or I could be disabled, just as you could, even if I'm fit and you're not, or if you're fit and I'm not. These things, people can smoke 2 packs a day and drink a bunch and live to 100, and others don't. I'm not suggesting it's completely random. There are relationships for behavior and consequences. but to a limit. And after that limit, the person who runs the marathon and eats the healthiest foods at age 30, as has happened with some friends, one particular friend of mine could go in at 30 and get a diagnosis of a malignancy and be dead in 6 months after a life of almost chastity and purity of health-conscious living. So we can reduce the amount of diciness or chance or hazard in human existence to a certain point. And I would almost suggest, though I don't know that the scriptures support this, that, if you will, the Creator has left this chance and this hazard as almost as a gift, because it's an opportunity for us to see that we're vulnerable. We all share that same participation in chance and hazard. This is the premise of, for example, notions of a collective commitment to healthcare as well, to be more specific about this. The reason I should the reasoning behind the idea that I should put in money, even though I'm extremely healthy, so that you can get an operation that you need, why should I do that? I didn't do anything to create that condition in you. Well, it's true I didn't do anything to create that condition in you, nor did you do anything to create that condition in you in general, and I might be the next one to go. So the idea of a universal health care, or any kind of social safety net, is a recognition that we are all subject to the kind of hazards of chance in that way. And in the modern language, we talk about sharing that risk. We share that risk because we share that condition. And so it's the objective truth behind that moral claim, the objective truth that any one of us could stand or fall to a certain extent. That's a fact. So based on that fact, what does that recommend for us from the standpoint of morality or justice? What's the right response? Is it, I should get whatever I pay for only, and you can get whatever you pay for? Or is it something different? Should it be left entirely to your ability to pay, let's say, or is there a commitment to a common good? Those are some of the things that I wanted to at least bring today in a short time. I've got to leave the fair portion to my colleague, Dr. Barnes.